Welcome to the Family Pictures Podcast. I'm Michael Branson Smith, and this is Jim Groom.
Hello.
And Jim, I'm a little freaking tender meatloaf and pig meatball tongue dim Kumpen Frankfurter. I'm a frustrated man here, Jim.
It's like the Frenchman in the
get it out.
Holy Grail.
I am the upset and lovable dad of A Christmas Story, the probably first modern Christmas movie classic from 1983, directed by Bob Clark, which was greenlit for this movie he wanted to do for years after the incredibly successful genre-bending Porky's, which he had successfully launched the raunchy teen sex comedy yet a year earlier. And off that success, he gets to make a wholesome family classic.
What a strange career Bob Clark has had. That's all I have to say. There is some wild films. The slasher film, the Canadian slasher film with Black Christmas. I mean, super weird.
And so this film is principally written by Gene Shepard, who is basically a talk radio superstar of the 70s and 80s, 60s and 70s, who kind of, in my mind, was this kind of hybrid of Howard Stern and Henry Rollins, where he had kind of discovered the value of the spoken word, like just putting a story out there, but also trying to entertain his radio audiences with pranks, where there was a story of him fabricating a book that he asked all of his fans to go to stores and bookshops and say, like, hey, do you have this book? I Spartacus. It wasn't I Spartacus, but the name of it. And which led to all these booksellers trying to order it, right? And then it led to him literally creating the book weeks later with a colleague of his. So he was this classic prankster who had this voice, and it's his voice that drives the entire film. He is the voiceover narrator as the adult version of Ralphie Parker. And just as a summary, this is the story of the Parker family, of Mr. and Mrs. Parker. There is no name for the mother and father. He's also known as the old man, the cranky old man, right? That's about it. And Ralphie is a 9-year-old boy who wants nothing else than his what is the name of this? The Red Ryder 200 shot range rifle. Air rifle, and this is his passion and desire for the entire film, but it's really mostly about a middle-class family in northern Indiana in the time is like the early 30s, late 40s, and it's 30s, Christmas definitely. Time, and it's the first Christmas picture that's really about family. It's not this fantastical It's a Wonderful Life where, it's dark but beatific at the same time, and old family values that are just remembered and presented on screen. So this is probably one of the most archetypal family pictures we could possibly do, right, Jim?
I think so. I mean, I was doing a little research on this, and I accentuate little research on this film. And it's the only film we've talked about, now we've only talked about 5 so far, that is part of the, film registry preservation. It was inducted in 2012. It is by all means considered culturally and aesthetically and historically relevant for the American experience, as 900 other films like it that have been, the Library of Congress have, committed to preserve. So that's there. So it's interesting. Like, it's such a phenomenon that it's considered culturally, aesthetically, and historically significant. So that's something to keep in mind here, people. Like, this film is significant.
And as part of that significance, like, I think in the moment it wasn't. No, which is probably the thing that matters here, right? So this is a film that it was a Bob Clark passion project. He heard Gene Shepard tell the story of Flick sticking his tongue on a frozen pole and therefore freezing his tongue to the pole, which is reproduced in the film. And he was on his way to a date, apparently driving. And this is back when you can't possibly ever get to hear something again if you don't actually just stay in the car. So he was a half hour late to his date just so he could listen to this.
That's awesome.
Right. And this is the kind of, I remember this is something I used to do, like This American Life was a radio show that's still incredibly popular, PBS show out of Chicago. And, if I was going grocery shopping in the early 2000s and it was really good, I was like, well, I guess I'm staying in the car, right? It's like, there's no way the internet doesn't really exist in that manner where you can just find anything. You're like, I'll pick that up later, or I'll pause my podcast. And so the origin even of this film, where he's like the director Bob Clark, this is part of an era where things are ephemeral, right? And fantasies are still real because everything is ephemeral. And I think so much of this story is about fantasy and boyhood. How does that come to play? And to you, Jim Groom, like in terms of your personal life, and of course Ralphie Parker, who's our avatar of what it means to be a boy who wants just to be adored. Yeah.
A 9-year-old boy, right? Like, here we have a 9-year-old boy. All he wants in the world is this BB gun, and the Red Ryder BB gun. And yeah, I mean, this film, I'm not one of the people, like, I'm not a diehard lover of this film, let me be clear. I see its value for sure, but I think what it does really well is it captures this magic of, like, the present, the thing you're going to get, and the family drama kind of around that, like whether you're going to get it. So here's a quick story. Me as a 10-year-old, this is 81, right? I want nothing more. This is my Red Ryder BB gun. There's nothing more that I want than the Atari 2600. The Atari at that point, I think it was still called the VCS, because there wasn't a 5200 where they had to call this the 2600. So they basically, it was the Atari home video console, like the kind of beginning of home video games in some ways. And I wanted this more than anything. And so my mom shopped for 7 kids because we were a gigantic family, something that comes up again on this podcast. And so she had a gigantic walk-in closet. And she would just go to like Play World or wherever and put all the bags in and just throw them in the closet, right? And I was a devious 10-year-old. And so I was like, oh, they're all in there. And so I went in there. I saw that I got the Atari. I saw that I got Missile Command, Asteroids, and what was the third one? The third one will come to me. Space Invaders. And so basically I got these 3 games and this system. And it was like December 12th. Like, I can't wait. So I took them. I went to my friend's house. I set it up, and I played it for like a week because my mom didn't know what was going on. And then I went back. I brought the whole thing back, repackaged it up because it hadn't been wrapped yet. And, she had kind of figured it out that I had done that because, some of the games were open or I ripped the thing. And she kind of put 2 and 2 together because I was like that. I was one of those kids who was always looking and opening and unwrapping and then rewrapping my own presents. And though she was like, I'm really disappointed in you, Jimmy. Like, this was your big present and you ruined it for yourself, and I hope you're happy. And that's like one of my great regrets in life.
Oh, yeah.
It's that moment where my mom didn't get pissed, she didn't chase me around with like a fucking rolling pin. She was just like, you're kind of a jerk.
Right, because this is the moment, and it's one of the best moments. I mean, we'll get to it later, where he does finally get his fantasy comes true, right? But it is a big part of this story. Is like, for me, the department store and spending hours just walking the department store toy section while my mom was doing other shopping for clothes I wouldn't want to wear later, and you would just stare at the figurines, or you'd stare at the Lego sets, or the
Star
mini
Wars
handheld
figures.
the handheld game cartridges. And this is the origin of like story of the commercial film too. Even though it's not particularly commercial itself, it talks about a character, Red Ryder, who was like the archetype of the original multimodal commercial venture. It was a comic book. It was a little those little kid books, the little picture books. It was a TV. It was a radio show. It was live shows. It was the BB guns, the products. It was everywhere. It started in 1938, and it was like it lasted into the 60s because it was so freaking big. And it made so much money in so many different ways. And that's kind of how Christmas movies are now, or so many movies for kids. It's just like, how do we basically frame a story around a product? And in this particular case, it's framed around a product that you couldn't buy anymore. Yeah. But at the same time, if it was produced now, there's no freaking way it wouldn't have been a product that would have been available in stores within hours.
Like that Red Ranger gun would have been the biggest kind of, Christmas gift of the year of 83,
But it was poorly at the time. They didn't get it. Like, so, we talked about how Bob Clark struggled to get the movie made, and it was only because he made Porky's that he was able to get it funded for only $4 million.
Sure.
And the funny thing is, they also just bungled the release. They released it like weeks before Thanksgiving. Right?
Yeah.
And so it kind of lingered around into the new year, and no one really watched it that much. It did fine. It made money, but it wasn't until they did what so many things in the 80s did, was it was on VHS, and then it was on cable TV. And this thing peaked to the point that to this day, this show is shown on 2 broadcast networks. Not that they matter anymore. For TNT and TBS for 24 hours.
That was funny to me in the 90s.
Back to back.
When that started happening, I was like, this film has transcended a cute 80s Christmas movie to be kind of in some ways, like you're saying, the beginning of the Christmas movie. And I think it's interesting because this is 83, and by 89, you have Christmas Vacation. And I think that's when you start to solidify the idea of Christmas movies are cool. Christmas movies are fun.
Yeah.
A lot of the Christmas marketing that was happening while I was growing up around Atari or whatever, like it was happening in catalogs or it was happening on TV. So you would have the Bass and Rankin, all the kind of, Frosty the Snowman and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and those cool animations, and then you'd have the commercials in between or the Saturday morning cartoons. But Christmas or the Babes in Toyland with Laurel and Hardy, but you wouldn't have Christmas movies per se. You'd have Christmas television. And so it would, like even the Star Wars Christmas special, if you will, like it was a very different focus. This movie is kind of, like you said, it was forgotten. And in 84, they re-released it and it had more success at Christmas time. But they were still trying to figure out Hollywood was like, there's something to this Christmas movie thing.
Right. And it's really about, it's a family movie. And that's why it's the dysfunctional family, or the family that Christmas isn't perfect in any way imaginable. It is like a struggle to satisfy your desires as a little child, as an adult to manage all the wrapping of presents and making of food and the visiting family that you don't want to see. And that's what they realize, like, wait, this is just a dysfunctional family story, and that's what makes this so compelling, right? And so to kind of start talking about the actual family, so it is made up of Ralphie. Actually, we should spend a little more time on Peter Billingsley, because before this film, he had literally done well over 100 commercials at this point. He's like 11 years old playing a 9-year-old, and he is just ubiquitous. He has this role he repeats that they do in commercials called Messy Marvin when he's selling Hershey's chocolate syrup. But he's done he did it. You'd love it. I'll show some of these in the notes in the when I post this. He does an early Star Wars figurine commercial with Christian Slater. I swear, and you're like, I barely recognize Christian Slater because he's got so many wrinkles from so much smoking, and he's just like this boyish little kid, and he's just been everywhere. It culminates with he was the kid who was the representative of NASA, kids in space programs, right, to get kids inspired in space. And he was there when Krista McAuliffe blew up in the Challenger. Like he was live at the launch, and freaking network news is talking to Peter Billingsley about, which was kind of disgusting. He's like a 13-year-old boy, and it's like, what did you think when she blew up? He was supposed to go to space. If Krista McAuliffe came back, he was going to be the first kid to go to space.
Oh my gosh, I did not know that. Crazy.
Yeah, so this is a boy that we all knew, and the funny thing is, he was the first person to try out for the role, and Bob Clark was like, he's too obvious. And so they auditioned 8,000 more boys before they got back to the obvious and cast Peter Billingsley.
Yeah, and he is. I mean, let's face it, like, for all the stuff he's done, this is what you'll remember Peter Billingsley for, and it's a kind of iconic role. And as that kid, and, you know, he plays it well. Like him, I love it when he's in front of the window looking at it and like mumbling to himself. I just like, it's a bizarre scene where he's just like in this trance with the gun and mumbling to himself while the other kids have their faces up against the window. So great.
Right. And you know, he had the year before done this film Death Valley, which we may have to do. This is a horror film that I think it sounds like a schlock film that sounds like kind of fun. His mother in this film, Dick Richards, is the director, and I bring this up only because he described Billingsley as a young kid with a 40-year-old brain. Like that, he was one of those crazy Haley Joe's Osmond that just incredibly precocious. You know, he speaks beyond articulate than most adults, right? And he's only 9 or 8 or 7 because he had started this stuff when he was 2 years old, and he was like in a Geritol commercial as a toddler. So
I did see him in that later 80s film Arcade, where he's one of the kids who goes into this virtual reality kind of world. They're giving out consoles, and it's a pretty good B movie. So he's in that.
His movie career post is pretty rough because he ages out of being the cute little kid, and that's tough.
Yeah, it is
but
tough.
He does survive, thankfully, as an adult, where so many kid actors, like, they just get eaten alive, right?
Yeah.
Especially, he's lucky he didn't become a heartthrob, probably, ultimately, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah. That's the worst.
Those are the ones. Yeah. And so much of one of the aspects of this family presented is through meals, right? And the character of the father's role versus the mother's role in the family kitchen kind of set it. Give us of the many meals that were presented in the film. Give us a setting. What because it's always the same. That's what I love about it.
I mean, the meals. There's the breakfast meal that starts, and it's interesting because at the breakfast table, he says Tinker Toys when his mom shoots him down for the gun. And I love that because we hear that in Mr. Mom. Tinker Toys. So Tinker Toys as a toy is still relevant from the 30s till the 80s, which I find fascinating as a but they don't eat. They go off to school, but the dad is having his toast and they're doing this thing. I mean,
he's reading the paper.
He's reading the paper, talking about the Cubs, I think.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. He's like, it's northern Indiana, so he's like a Chicago sports fan.
Yeah.
And I think the thing is, like, so mom is trying to satisfy everybody, barely paying attention to her husband. He's in his own little world, and he's always frustrated, swearing. And he, to me, is that classic archetype of the man of the house that wants nothing more than to just not be aggravated, right? Like his entire life is to, how can I avoid aggravation, right? But at the same time, this isn't his entire joy is in pride is to overcome whatever calamities that stymie his day, including like he's the, and this is, Ralphie is like in awe of his father's abilities in this case, right? His ability to manage the Oldsmobile that's frozen, right? Like this is back when you had to pour hot water on an engine to get it started, right? Which is nuts. And his furnace, he's always coming out of a billowing pile of like coal smoke, and it probably was coal if you think about it, like,
And fuses, the way he was able to change fuses so quickly, change tires, right?
Yep.
It's interesting.
And that's like his role versus the mom who's, you don't get any sense of, she's a homemaker, but the thing that's great about her is she's still a kid at heart, right? Like she's the one who's managing Randy, who's like his role. He's the younger brother who's like a bubble tick in his winter suit the whole time, who does nothing more than basically cry and wobble around. and he fights with his brother too, which is fun too.
That tick, he's like basically a tick that's ready to pop. That whole scene where the brother is dressed up by the mom and he can't move his arms. That scene is kind of haunting. If you've ever been dressed up for one of those snowstorms, like, the 78, snowstorm in the Northeast, which basically was a blizzard. Like, I remember, like, after that, people were freaked out. People died and it was serious. And like, my mom would dress us up, like, seriously, with the moon boots and the snow pants. And like, seeing that scene is a little bit like, like, because you can't move and you're going out there. Like, there's some points where this becomes a little bit horrific, or almost like, how would you say, like David Lynchian with the way in which some of this stuff goes. Like, it seems very like family-wise, but there's also these deep, dark points, like the kid on the ground not able to get up.
Poor Randy.
It's horrific for me, those scenes.
And that speaks to also, we'll get to a moment, is like the terrifying kid, right? Like the bully, and which was a real thing, right? Like this idea of navigating, your way to school. You're always going to have to deal with the bully. In this case, it was
Farkas.
Scott Farkas, right?
Yeah.
And
who looks like a fox. Like, he's got a crazy looking kid with the Daniel Boone hat. Oh my God.
And so, and this is something like I even remember, like, I had a friend that lived up my block, and across the street, he had Chris Curtis. And Chris Curtis was about 6 years older than us. He was in high school when we were in like third grade, and he was freaking terrifying. He would throw rocks at us from across the street while we were just trying to play frisbee on the front lawn, and it was just like, that's what it was like. You were just gonna be assaulted, while on your friend's front lawn, and that's what they dealt with every day. And there's multiple scenes where they just harken back to them just all running from Farkas, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's 5 or 6 times they'll just have this little interstitial where it's wound up fast, sped up. Even the sound is sped up as they're running away from Scott Farkas, who's gonna, and we see Flick has got a black eye from him, and he gets like his pantsed by him. It's just terrible, right?
No, there was, and you see, there's we'll talk about the school stuff, but like the whole kid. We talked about this again in The Outsiders, with Dally harassing the little boys in the field, and you do this, and this does this pretty well. Like, Farkas is great, and then they're there, and this kind of, and I don't know if you've read too much Stephen King, but probably the scariest character in Stephen King is not necessarily it, or some ghost in The Shining, or some car in Christine, is this Broward kid in It, who is basically harassing the kids. And like, he doesn't even just like throw rocks or beat them up. Like, he, like, when he gets them, he like mutilates them. And he's this like older kid in Stephen King that I think is actually the scariest figure of all the books I've read of Stephen King. And it kind of makes a point that, like, this is a scary figure, the older kid who's abusive, and it's real, particularly in the 70s and 80s. My kids have not really had this experience. Like, they haven't had these kids who just haunt them in the same way.
Yeah. And they are haunting. Like, they are ever present. You are kind of looking over your shoulder while playing the front lawn, because Chris Curtis might be spying through the window and see us and decide to come out and start like launching shit at us, And that's and you're like, what the fuck, man? I'm just a kid.
I'll tell you a BB gun story. So, there's kids in my neighborhood, older, like you said, a couple of years older, but tougher than I was. And like, we were at a school playing, and this guy had a BB gun, and so they were like, get up against the wall. And I was like, what? He's like, get up against the wall. And they're like, I'm like, why? He's like, well, I can either shoot you in the head with the BB gun, or I can shoot you in the ass. And it's going to hurt less if I shoot you in the ass. So I had to go up against the wall, stay there and get shot in the ass with a BB gun. And it hurt like hell.
And it hurt like hell, Jim.
It hurt like hell. So, yeah, this is real. I feel this. It's worse than Farkas.
Well, I mean, it is soft pedaled technically in the film because, ultimately Ralphie gets his revenge when Ralphie, he's just had his heart broken in school. And we should talk about school. So in school, we have Miss Shields, who's the teacher who the kids are constantly trying to prank. And, this leads to they're in their recess, and this is where Flick sticks his tongue on the metal pole, and everybody doesn't know what to do with them, so they all just leave him there. And it's Miss Shields who has to be like, "What happened to Flick, everybody?" And they're like, and this is another thing that I love about that is an honors presentation of children. In the face of wrongdoing, a child's ability to ignore wrongdoing or lie about wrongdoing is just one of my favorite things. Literally, like, you can see Flick out the window from the classroom, and all the kids are like, "I don't know," just like. And when one girl finally says, "I think he's like over there," and the teacher doesn't know who it is, and like. In the willingness to be like, "It wasn't me. I have no idea what you're talking about."
Deny, right?
I
Like
may be his best friend, but I haven't a clue what happened.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah, they're come with the teeth. Like, they're kind of like miscreants, right? They come with the teeth.
Yeah.
They deny any wrongdoing. They're happy to lie and get away with it. Like, in that regard, like, they're subverting expectations of like the shattered kid at once something goes wrong. And that teacher is an interesting teacher. You talked a little bit about, her kind of helping them. But then there's also a point when they get in their themes, like you said. And I love that they call them themes, not essays, because that's still what they call them in Italy. They call them tema. And whenever my kids say tema, I'm going to do a tema. I'm like, what is a tema? And they translate it as a theme. I'm like, what the hell is a theme? They're like, oh, like I don't know. And I'm like, an essay? And like, oh, I guess they don't really know the word essay. So it's like, oh, interesting that they would say theme. So there's some kind of history in the US. A couple of things about the school. The building, for me, is so familiar. These buildings must have been made in the 20s or 30s. And these are buildings on Long Island like I went to. These big brick school edifices that had multi-levels, and you would go in and just the field with houses around them. Like, so much of this world.
Yeah, there's so much in a neighborhood.
Yeah, and there's so much of this world oddly felt familiar, but familiar like what my growing up was maybe 30 years older, when everything was a bit newer. The neighborhoods were a bit kind of more like maybe less 80s in that regard. But like my neighborhood on Long Island would have emerged in the 30s, right? Like that's kind of when the farming in the late 18th or 19th century starts to shift, and suburbia comes in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And so like that would be it too. And so I felt very attached to it. But the other thing that I think is cool, and hear me out, I think this is a reference. I think Wes Anderson is taking a whole scene from A Christmas Story and reworking it in Rushmore. So there's the whole fantasy that Randy has that he puts in his theme about getting the Red Raider rifle, the Red Ryder rifle, and he just imagines that she reads it. She's reading all the other ones and they're terrible, and she's in this Victorian outfit with this hat. She's like, I don't know why, but it's a great little fantasy. And then she gets to his, and the light opens and she says A+++++, and everyone puts a Randy on their things, and he'll never have to write a theme again, and that's the end. Well, that's exactly how Rushmore opens. So basically the main character of Rushmore is there, and they're like, what about that equation, professor? And professor's like, oh no, don't worry about that. They're like, why not? Well, no, it's the hardest geometrical equation in the world, and my professor, my mentor at MIT can't even do it, so I can't imagine anyone here could. But if anyone could, I can guarantee that you will all never have to open a math book for the rest of your life. And so then everyone's like, Max, Max, Max. And then they say, Max, do you want to try it? And he's there at the newspaper. He's like, did somebody say my name? And then he goes up and does it. And then they all have him on his things. It's the same scene, just redone.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this film, I think, did have obviously a big. We've talking about its stature as a Christmas movie archetype that spawns so many after it, and it's funny. It's like a combination of this Bob Clark version of Gene Shepard's work, but I think in many ways it's Gene Shepard is the inspiration here, the writer, radio talk show performer, and this idea of reflecting on your past and reveling in fantasy life of a child or a young adult, whatever that may be, and his ability to craft that story. And so many of these stories, and that's the whole thing, is this film is ultimately a set of vignettes that he told on radio or in front of audiences. He became like a mini pop star, at that time, going from college campus to college campus, doing his stand-up spoken word routine, and so had super fans. And people would think it's like a nostalgic trap, but I don't, because I think he's realistic about how this is not a perfect time by any stretch of the imagination, right? So, a good example is like, they're having a wonderful Christmas, and we'll get to the Christmas story, the final Christmas day. But as part of that, the day is destroyed by the neighbor's dogs, right? And just trashes the dinner, eating the turkey that the old man is so excited to finally get to eat. He looks forward to it because it's turkey, like in American culture, like turkey is eaten only once a year, right? There's there's millions of turkeys slaughtered in the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving or in a little bit Christmas.
Yeah.
And then no turkey, and all the turkeys are like, "I made it!"
Exactly. It's like the salmon's getting away from the bear. Like, I'm up.
Yeah. And then you got at least another year before you're potentially on the chopping block. And so, yeah, this way of looking at ourselves is a big part of this story. And I find that the school does that, and just how he gets himself in trouble with, it's going to be so bad. This is another big part of this story, is like, when you do something wrong and you are caught, you're dead. Like, your mother is going to like make you literally eat soap, and your father is going to murder you.
Kill you.
And there's two scenes in which this kind of plays out. The first one is when Ralphie is trying to support his father for the first time ever. He's so excited. I'm going to help my dad change the tire. And he's holding the hubcap filled with the nuts. And his dad, and it's not even his fault, his dad like knocks into it and flicks all the hardware into the air. And he says, "Oh, fudge." And his dad, but he does. But I didn't say
fudge.
I didn't say fudge. I said the queen mother of all dirty words. And this is Shepard's like beautiful language. It was F, asterisk, 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 right? And his dad looks at him. Right?
Best look in the whole movie. The best single moment of acting in the whole movie is when dad looks at the son after he knocks the things over and the son curses, and that look is a look I think everyone's had. It's so familiar. That father, the actor, nails it. And it was like, oh, no.
And he's in trouble, and he knows he's in trouble. Like, this is the opposite of like wiggling out of things. This is like, you're busted. So how do you wiggle out of being busted, or how do you deal with being busted? And it's part of it. A big part of it is dealing with the time before the repercussions. So he just goes right back into the car, and his mom's like, "How did it go?" And he's like, not saying anything. And then his father gets in the car because he's like lickety split with changing tires, and he tells her what he said, and she flips out. right? And then he also, back home, she's the administrator of punishment, and he has the soap in his mouth. But she says, well, where did you learn this? Meanwhile, he's like, I can't say it, but it's my dad. Like, he's like the mother of all swear. He's like, there's various moments where he describes his ability to curse. That's, an artistry. Like, he's a pure master of cursing.
It's his medium, right?
Yeah, right. But at the same time, he can't do that. That's too real. So he says, it was Schwartz. It's one of his best friends. So his mom calls Schwartz's mom, and in the background we hear literally Schwartz's mom beating Schwartz to death.
Oh my God. That is another, that whole idea of ratting out your friends to avoid things is another thing I can deeply relate to. Oh, it's horrible. But yeah, I remember, quick story, I was up in Lake George. This is not a Christmas story. And me and my friend, really good friend, I still, talk to him and
How
see
old
him
were you?
to this day, right? We were 12, 13. Okay. And I was much taller than him. He was relatively short. And we were in this Gaslight Village. It was a kind of a Lake George place. I don't know if it's still there. Kind of like an amusement park. And we hid in one of these like wooden caves. And we were like a self-made attraction. When people would come by, we would like put our arms out and scare them. And they'd be like, whoa, right? And then so we were having fun. But I did it, and I hit a girl in the face and knocked her down and like didn't realize. And I was like, shit. And then her dad comes up and it's like, what the hell's going on? What are you like comes in and he's big and I'm fucking scared. I'm like, it wasn't me. It was the other kid in here. And I ran. And my friend was like, dude, that is so messed up. Like that guy, and luckily he was smaller, so the guy didn't do anything. I think the guy might have known it was me, but I got away and my friend did it. And yeah, so if you're ever in a foxhole with me, you know what to expect.
I mean, and that's the thing. It's like when you're a kid, you don't know how to process scary adults, bullies, like, and you're just like, you're constantly calculating, like this is not the now where parents are much more chill or supposed to be much more chill with their kids and be like, their friends are supportive. This is like your parents, the bullies, they were terrifying because when they got upset, it was like, it was a warpath they would go on. There was screaming, there was yelling, there was all sorts of, there was hitting. And so that's the other moment, which is the combo deal. We've talked about this essay, this theme that Ralphie's going to do, and he's going to say, like, I'm going to create this perfect essay that's going to convince Miss Shields that I deserve this BB gun, and she's going to tell my mom. Meanwhile, he gets it back, and it's like C++, C+, and he's like, and it's like, you'll shoot your eye out, kid, which is the refrain of the film. And he's so dejected, and he's crying, half crying on his way home, the way that Billingsley does so well. And he runs into Farkas, and he's already like an emotional mess. And Farkas just does what Farkas does. He starts just digging in him and like making it worse.
Cry, you're going to cry, little baby, you're going to cry.
Yeah. And Ralphie flips, and he goes and he tackles Farkas, and he just starts beating him mercilessly and also swearing mercilessly, which is the best. But again, I love this movie because it's not like it uses any profanity. It's all freaking, and so there's this endless stream of fake profanity while he's pummeling him, and all the kids are showing up and they're all freaking out because they're like, oh my God, he's beating up Farkas. But what they're more freaking out about is that Ralphie's mom comes around the corner because Randy has gone to get her. Like, you gotta save. And this I distinctly remember is like being a kid and having an older sibling get in a fight.
Yeah.
And it was like, or get hurt, and it's terrifying. And so what do? You run to your mom, and you're like, this, you got to get her. Like, this is when this is that balance between like being terrified of your parents and really like, thank God you exist because this situation is so screwed up and I need you to stop it. Right. And so she gets him. Yeah.
Okay. I want you to finish.
Yeah.
I'm going to let you finish.
Oh, thank you, Jim. And so she shows up Ralphie instantly turns into a puddle of crying, like, thank God you're here. I don't want to be this person, which is actually kind of sweet. But the best part is he's literally beaten Farkas.
Bloody.
And she just walks away from bloody. And she walks away from
bloody.
And his mom is like, doesn't even look at him. She cares two shits about this other boy.
It's so good.
Which again, that's a 30s thing. It's like, you're not mine.
Yeah.
See ya.
And you brought it up before. I'll tell my story, but you brought it up before. There's also this sense like, the kids, it's like, leave us alone. Like there's that adult kid thing, which still exists. I see here in Italy a little bit where it's like, you're a kid. Shut up and go do your thing. Like, I don't want to hear from you, right? Like, I don't want to kind of, like that whole idea of the adult-kid divide. It still seems somewhat existent. Like the father is still, he's the big, larger-than-life figure, right? But he doesn't really feel like he can go up and say, hey, Pops, do this, or hey, Mom, do this. Like, there's a certain amount of fear and a certain amount of, like, I would say removal, if you will. So anyway, about people going to get their parent or their brother or sister, right? So I get in a fight. I'm in like 5th grade. I get in a fight with a 6th grader. His name was Vinny Mishke. He lived right next to the school. I get in a fight, kicks my ass. So I'm like, pissed, right? But I always thought I could beat him up. So I go home. I get my older brother, right? Who's like kind of bigger and tougher. He's like 4 years older than me. And I'm like, come with me. Vinny Mishke just beat me up. And I'm thinking, I'm bringing my brother, and my brother's going to come, and, we're going to get Vinny Mishke. So my brother comes, and Vinny Mishke's still there. And my brother said, did you beat up my brother? And Vinny Mishke's like, yeah. He's like, okay, fight him again, right? Vinny Mishke beats me up again. And then my brother says, what do you want me to do? You got beat up? Like, no reprieve. Like, I got beat up twice. I was like, you're not going to help me?
Nope. That's how it rolls. And so Ralphie, after beating Farkas, he's again knows he's in trouble. But this time, his mom, does him a solid. Like, his mom plays this role of, she's the one who actually gets the kids, right? She's like, Randy, he's the kid who won't eat. He's constantly playing with his food, and she gets him to behave like a pig and stick his face in his food to get him to eat.
It's just a weird scene.
Yeah. And she also is the one that, she's singing with the kids, the Christmas songs, and then making a joke out of with the fart sounds at the end. And so she's a great mom. She's the mom who's like, yeah, you're in trouble for saying, fudge, but at the same time, I want you to be okay, and I want to have fun with you too, because, my husband's like a curmudgeon, right? And so he thinks that she's gonna like do what happened, the reverse, when he told, when the old man told her about what he said. She doesn't tell him. She says he got in a fight, but she doesn't make a big deal about it. She doesn't, talk about the swearing at all. She doesn't talk about that the kid's bloodied. And today this would be like lawsuit material, right? We'd be hearing from parents' lawyers and shit like that.
Absolutely.
Right? And so, but instead, he's like, wow, my mom. And he literally talks about this is a life-changing moment in his relationship with his mother. And so this is that child parent relationship thing where he's playing with, he doesn't quite get them in the way he thinks he gets them, right? And it's this mini moment of revelation of like, wait a minute, I don't get adults, or I thought I got adults, and maybe they're not exactly how I imagined they would be.
Yeah. No, it's I love that moment, because also I kind of imagine my mom and, all that in similar ways. And so that idea of mom is to protect her. And mom is kind of like got your back no matter what. Like,
right.
Yeah, that's a great scene in this movie. And she's an interesting, character, right? Because she also holds her ground against the father with that hideous lamp that they go to war over. And she's basically like, I don't know what happened to it, and then laughing while he's trying to glue it back together. Like, I kind of dig her because, she's getting her shots in on him. He might be the blustery one, but she's the one who's ruling the house.
Right. Which I think, we should come to where you would imagine this film has to end, which is around Christmas morning, right? And it creates the tension of being a kid the night before, and you're just a live wire as a kid, right? And the presents, and we've even skipped over like their visit to Santa Land, and Santa is kind of a blowhard who basically note. Yeah, we should talk about that because they go to things. Santa Land at the classic department store.
And the decoder. Let's talk about both quickly.
Okay. So it's Santa Land. It's not this 50s version of what we think of Santa, who's this beatific character. He's a dude who's like, there's no way that Higbee's is keeping me after 9 p.m. I am done. And the elves are crazy angry. They're just like, oh, these kids are so dirty and gross and stupid.
They're like the kids from The Brood by Cronenberg, if you've ever seen that. Oh.
Yeah. And each and every one of them is like the elf takes the kid, slams him on Santa's lap. The kid screams in terror. And then the next elf takes the kid and shoves him down the slide.
Right. And those, I think also like, the great scene there, too, is it's like a precursor of what we'll see later when, Christmas movies take off. And then you can even have like a bad Santa, right? And these kind of haunted. It's, Santa, like I think played by Billy Bob Thornton in that Bad Santa movie where he's really terrible and the elves. And so it kind of precursors that, you ready for the other side,
It does do a good job of, like we've said, dismantling all the perfections that Christmas was in all of these cartoons the animations that we were exposed to I loved. They were incredible. But they were all just like, this is the perfect Christmas story where, Gene Shepherd this is a Christmas story, meaning a real Christmas story.
No, that's a good point. I also like in that scene in the mall, which you'd be in the mall and everyone's there, like you said, you would kind of identify with that, decades later, looking around and all this stuff. But there's also these cosplay, Wizard of Oz folks, which puts it right in the 30s. Like you'd have these Wizard of Oz folks going, and the kid's like, I love Santa Claus. And then he's like, I love Wizard of Oz. Like all the things he loves, right? But the other scene, so, I'll do it quickly. Ralphie gets the decoder ring that he's been waiting for. It's the Little Orphan Annie decoder ring, and he's really excited about it. So he gets it. And, what they say at the end of the radio station is, here are the 10 or 15 or 20 numbers. Be sure to decode them, Little Orphan Annie, save her or whatever. So he goes in the bathroom, my place you can be safe, and he does it. And what it basically says is to the tune of, don't forget to drink your Ovaltine. And he's like, a crummy commercial. And I think it's interesting because of what we said earlier. Like, this film was not merchandised or marketed, in the same way that a Christmas film of this kind of element would be now, right? There would be stuff in the toy stores. There would be. And so in some ways, you couldn't really even have this crummy commercial idea. Or if you would, it would have to be tongue in cheek, knowing that, actually your film is just a big commercial with product placement. Yet it can work in this film because this film wasn't that, right? So it's an interesting kind of twist because the Christmas film that moves out for kids, on the decades hence that we're dealing with now, this couldn't happen just because there's no sense that these movies are anything but commercials, right?
Yeah.
Like they're big commercials.
Right, yeah. And the final commercial is, Christmas morning, right? Yeah. Which is the real thing to a certain extent. Like the kids, you inevitably fall asleep, but when you wake up and you're like, whoa, wait, I know what time it is. And you run down and there's all the presents there and you're just like freaking out and you're like, get up parents, let's do this, let's jam, we got to pull some wrapping paper off. And so that starts to happen and they're pulling everything apart and there's the bowling ball for dad and the socks for the kids and the bad bunny out from the aunt, and it's all just this milieu of typical stuff, right? But in the end, Ralphie's upset. He's like, and the parents are playing off of him. It's like, so how was it? Did you get everything you want? He's like, yeah.
Kinda.
No, it's kinda. And his dad says, well, wait a minute. I think there's one more. Santa must have hidden something behind the desk. And he goes and gets it. and of course it's the BB gun. And what's so wonderful about that thing is he's a kid again for the first time and only time in the film, the dad, where he's literally like pantomiming with his son, like load it this way, like he's using his hands and he's just like enjoying it with him in that moment. And it's the only moment where he has this like connection that's real with his son. Otherwise he's just an instrument that is part of being dad, and you're my son and you're aggravating me constantly. But in this brief liminal moment, he's like, this is our thing, right?
Yeah, it's I agree. That's a great scene. And you know, he kind of like, I had one too, and justifying it. Like, he comes through too. Like, the other thing is he comes through. There's no sense he will. You know, the kid also is not like me, like some spoiled brat 10-year-old who's breaking into the closet and playing the games. Like, he doesn't really know he's going to get it. Like, there's something sweet about that and that expectation. But the last piece, so that's great. I mean, Christmas morning is great. And then the Christmas dinner that never happens at the house is also great, because you talked about it earlier with the dogs coming in and eating the turkey. But that displacement and the mess that's made, the father's like, all right, kids, get dressed. We're going to dinner, right? And, you know, that created, I had never really had a sense of, you know, on Christmas Day, you know, if nothing's open but Chinese restaurants. Like, I guess that's a kind of thing or a theme or a trope. I don't know. But, like, this was the first time I saw that trope. This was the first time I was like, oh, yeah. Like, I have Jewish friends like, yeah, we just go out to dinner at a Chinese place, right? Like, we don't give a shit about your Christmas. And so, like, there's that whole kind of moment. And I love the scene. One of my favorite scenes is the scene in the Chinese restaurant when the guy chops off the duck's head. And
and the tra-la-la-la-la.
And, like, you can really feel, like, I love that scene because you can really feel like, yeah, that would be a memorable moment for a family. And they captured it. And like that idea of a vignette, but that idea also of storytelling in moments and the way in which it nails it, particularly in that scene, I really, really love the way it starts on that kind of, you know, it's like Chinese food and bowling, and then it goes in, and then you're there with them, and they're trying to sing Christmas songs. Like, go back to the
no,
thing.
Jim, it's so not good. Bowling. The W is out. It's bowling. It's bowling Chinese. The W is intentionally faded.
Oh, so I was thinking like there was a bowling alley attached.
No, but it must have been at one point a bowling alley, but they kept it, and they called it bowling Chinese.
Beautiful. Okay, there I go. Know? Bad read, Jim. Bad read.
No, it's fine. That's one I didn't catch the first time I was watching it, and I think like, yeah, I mean, this is our holiday movie. We're not going to be able to come back and do our next podcast until I think after the new year. Yeah. And, you know, this is, I think, our first true, I mean, Family Vacation is technically a family movie too, but this one is like the true, you know, bottle up. And the best thing about it is, in some ways, it's like there's literally no plot, right? Yeah. It is. This is the idea of, you know, comedies and television. You can just do a bunch of vignettes, and that's a story, because we just need to immerse ourselves in characters and situations. And sure, there's the plot of the BB gun, but it's referenced like about 4 or 5 times across the entire film. And of course it gives the payoff, but it doesn't end on the, he does literally shoot his eye out, by the way, which is hilarious. Exactly. And it's only because he's wearing glasses that he doesn't actually end up with a BB in his eyeball. And he manufactures yet another story to get out of trouble yet again with his mom, and which is awesome. But we get to revel in storytelling in this film in ways that we do as human beings. And I think that's its lasting impression on me, is that this film is, oh, do you remember when? Oh,
exactly.
And you couldn't help but do it at least 3 or 4 times, and myself too.
And I have like 5 more stories I could tell as a result of watching this, because
well, maybe we'll have like the someday we'll have our little special like premium section where Jim Groom just tells us stories.
Exactly. But no, I'm just saying, like, you're exactly right. I think that's a great way, you know, the art of storytelling in this film and the way in which that brings stories out of you, and probably why you can put it on for 24 hours over Christmas and come into it and come out of it. And I know when that started happening on TBS or TNT and in the 90s, and I was like, what a weird thing. But then, me and my family would sit around watching it and then telling stories, and then it would just kind of go. And I think it's a unique film in that regard. And I was interested that like Ebert at first gave it like 3 or 3.5 stars, or it was kind of like less kind of, he's usually far more accurate than Siskel, whereas Siskel was like, this was great, 4, boom, boom, boom.
Or this was terrible and being way off.
Exactly. Yeah, usually. But Ebert was like, yeah, it was good, whatever. But then he kind of later on changed it and was like, no, it's a 4-star and it's one of the great movies, which I think is interesting. Like, I didn't find out what went into his thinking on that, but I'm interested, like, at what point did he reevaluate and say like, this is a great movie?
Well, yeah, it was 2012 when it became a historically preserved film.
Exactly. And it's interesting because a lot of those, historically preserved films, like popular sentiment matters a lot because they take, basically, people like Big Lebowski. They say Big Lebowski got inducted because it had so many supporters. People would debate for it. So like a lot of that is also a popularity test of like what are the great movies that people love.
It's a popularity test, but it's a stands time test, I think, ultimately more importantly, right?
Yeah.
Because like this is like where the Academy Awards, you look back at like that one Best Picture and they get it so wrong. Like they just like it's too self-important, and that it's completely understandable in the 80s, like what was important. Oh, and this is one of the things to end on is like what was important was what Peter Billingsley would do 7 years later as he was aging out. He did a made-for-TV movie, one of the CBS school break specials with Vince Vaughn, a very young Vince Vaughn. And so that was important. You had to cover issues, right? And this one was, he was a kid who wanted to be a better athlete, but he was small, so he tries steroids.
So he could be as tall as Vince Vaughn.
Right. Nope. But the idea is like, that was that era. Like they just overlooked this because it was just like, it was too trite. It was too simple. It wasn't filled with a big message that was hitting you in the face.
Yeah.
And that's what they wanted back then. Right.
No.
And so that's why this movie lasts. And so many of those movies can be reassessed later on. And it is a popularity contest, of course, but it is a sustaining contest. Like it is.
I don't mean that in a bad way, to be clear. Like, I mean that like there were like people going to bat for it. Like,
right.
The other one was Back to the Future. Like, it's funny because I went there and I got a tour of the Library of Congress. They picked up on some of the blogging I was doing when I was going to their thing, seeing the movies and blogging about it. And I got a tour of it. And like they have like, these are the ones we're going up, and like here are all the kind of people who are pushing for this and why. And I was so fascinated, and not necessarily discounting that. Like there are films that no one knows about that they're preserving for other reasons. But those recent films are often surrounded by a very big kind of community who is pushing for it,
Yeah. Well, it is the end here, and have happy holidays, Jim Groom. We're not going to see each other probably until after the new year, and you probably will beat your kids mercilessly as a good dad does.
They will get nothing this Christmas. Well, happy holidays to everyone, and Michael, especially you. This has been a blast, and see you in the new year.
All right, thanks everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.